Maxx, everybody here that can see
Everybody should be here.
Yeah.
I think. I'm not going to count. I'm not going to count.
Okay.
Everyone should be here.
So I would like to introduce the bachelor end project of Maxx. And maybe you're wondering why so many people are here. And one of the reasons is that Maxx is actually contributing to a bigger project. It's called VROC. So that's VROC 1.0. It was run by Pierre Alouguet and Rémi Charton. And then we applied for VROC 2.0. That got also approved. And then that was notably also applied for by Dominique Medan-Villard. And while VROC 1.0 was focused on the rock outcrops that are now day zooming, so they are above the ground. In this project, we also look at, in a way, outcrops that are below the ground. And the idea of the whole project is to make a VR experience. I think Maxx will tell you about that and what he did in and later outside the Valkenburg mines. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So, of course, thank you all for coming to my final presentation. Today, we're going to be talking about exploring the Valkenburg mines. So, what am I going to talk about today? Well, first off, I'm just going to introduce the whole project, although Roderick already kind of did that. I'm just going to also give some background information. Afterwards, I'm going to talk about how we went to Valkenburg and how we scanned some areas of interest. After that, there we go. After that, I'm going to talk about how I optimized those 3D models to be light enough to work in VR. After that, we're going to talk about how I evaluated those 3D models, see how well it's optimized, and also how I could potentially improve those 3D models. Then I'm going to talk about how I added those models in virtual reality to create a small VR demo. And then finally, I'm going to give a conclusion. So let's start with some background information, because what's VROC? Well, Roderick already told you some things, but I'll just quickly recap some small things. So VROC is mostly an ongoing project about doing virtual fieldwork for bachelor students. And as Roderick said, we now want to expand that by going to the Valkenburg mines, where bachelor students are supposed to do post-mining safety analysis. And, well, it's fun and all, but somehow players need to walk through a 3D world. So that's where I come in, where I go to Valkenburg mines and then scan a part of the mine. So how do we do that? Well, for that, we use something called LiDAR. Light detection and ranging. It's just a 3D measurement tool which allows you to scan 3D objects. And it works by basically calculating the distance between the scanner and a point on the surface. And then it does it for a lot of different points. And then you end up with something called a point cloud, which you can barely see here. But it's basically just a whole cloud of different points. And from that point cloud, you can create something called a 3D mesh. So a 3D mesh is basically just a 3D surface made up of small different polygons. Well, what's a polygon? A polygon is just a simple triangle, where each triangle consists of 3 vertices, which are the corners of the triangle, 3 edges, which are, well, the edges of the triangle, and the face, which is what fills up the triangle. So you end up with something like this. This is a textured 3D mesh, although this is scanned pretty poorly, as you can see. But trust me, like the end results will be way better than this. So now that we know some background information, let's go to the Valkenburg mines. Because a couple of months ago, me together with Roderick and Dominique went to the Valkenburg mines to scan some areas of interest. Oh, sorry. The research question, of course. I didn't look at the slide. The main research question. What's it about? Well, how can LiDAR data and meshes from the Valkenburg mines be obtained, optimized, and visualized in virtual reality while preserving structural and visual fidelity for VROC? Well, now we're going to find out what I did a couple of months ago. So I went to Valkenburg mines, as I said. And we use basically 2 different iPhones equipped with a LiDAR scanner to scan our areas of interest. And to do that, we use an app called Scaniverse. It's free to use and it's very convenient because it automatically processes your 3D point cloud data to a 3D mesh, which is very handy. And the result looks something like this. These were our initial results. And you can see that these results look pretty good. You can see the pillars pretty well. It looks high resolution. However, one of the problems that you can't really see here is that the polygon count is very high in these models. So they're not light enough to run properly on virtual reality. And somehow we need to solve that. How can we reduce the amount of polygons in these models? Well, for that, we use something called quadratic error matrix with edge contraction. What's that? Well, let's start off with edge contraction. What's edge contraction? Well, it's basically what the figure shows here. When you have two vertices connected by an edge, you basically just merge the 2 points and then remove the edge. That way you can simplify a model. However, when do you contract which edge? Well, that's where quadratic error matrix comes into play. Quadratic error matrix basically calculates the cost of every edge in your 3D model. And that's a difficult way of saying that it calculates the amount of error induced by contraction for every edge. And then what it also tries to do is that it ranks every edge based on that cost, such that when you start optimizing your 3D model, edges with the lowest cost gets contracted first, such that the error is always minimized. And then you end up with something like this. So here the left model shows the structure of a part of a 3D model which you scanned. Although this is an exaggeration, the left part shows the unoptimized model, the right part shows the optimized model. And you can see that the structure is preserved pretty well. However, the same cannot be said for the texture of the 3D model, which is also an important part. And as you can see in the red circle, there seems to be some sort of discontinuity there. It doesn't look right. The right side is also kind of warped and stretched. So what happened there? Well, to understand what's going on, we need to look at something called a UV map. What's a UV map? Well, a UV map is basically just all the textures from your 3D model unwrapped and projected onto a 2D plane. It's maybe a bit difficult to understand, so that's why I took someone's face. It's basically just a face just plastered onto a 2D plane, but it also works the other way around, where you have your UV map, which you can then wrap around a 3D model, which is basically what I did here. I created my own custom UV map, such that you can see every single fragment from the UV map in your 3D model. And then I started optimizing that model. And since we're optimizing the structure, you wouldn't expect that the texture changes of your 3D model. However, as you can see in the red circle there, it kind of does. So that has to do with the edges of every fragment here. Because it has trouble when you're optimizing your 3D model, it has trouble interpolating what to do near those edges of your fragments. So that's why you can't really you get these visual artifacts basically. And now that we have our initial 3D models, I start evaluating them. So I'm first going to compare the original with the optimized 3D models. And first I'm going to talk about scan ranges and processing modes, but I'll get to that later. So I just overlapped the original with the optimized 3D models and calculated the difference at any point on the model, which resulted in this beautiful graph where it shows like box plots of every single model showing the error. And from the figure, you can see that for most models, the error is below 2 millimeters. And in worst case scenario, it's just below 4 millimeters. And that's already pretty good because you're not going to see a 4 millimeter difference in a 3D model. So that's good. However, we can always improve our models. So how can we do that? Well, in the beginning, I mentioned that we use 2 different iPhones to scan in the Valkenburg mines. One iPhone used a 5-meter scan range, which I call the long scan range. However, we also use another iPhone, which used a 2.5-meter scan range. I call it the medium scan range. And I thought, might as well compare the two with each other, see if there are any differences. Well, there are. If you look at the results here, you can see that initially, the original polygon count is way higher for the medium scan range. And when I start optimizing the 3D model, you can see that it's still more than double as high compared to the long scan range. So why can't I optimize the medium scan range model even more? Well, that has to do with the UV map again. Because for the medium scan range, the UV map is highly fractured, as you can see here. And a highly fractured UV map also means that texture artifacts are more frequent, which you can see here. So left shows part of an original model, unoptimized, and then the other 2 figures show the optimized model for the long and medium scan range. And when you look at the P, you can see for the medium scan range that it's highly warped, and as well as the targets below. Here it looks mostly normal, also kind of warped. But from this, we can say that we're not going to use the medium scan ranges, and we'll just discard them. However, I also told that in the Scanniverse app, you can process your point cloud data to a 3D mesh. However, you also have the option to choose how it processes it. So from all the models from before, I used something called the area mode. Scanniverse recommends it, so why not use it? But there's also something called the detail mode. And although we don't really know how it works, we can still see how it performs. And I also optimized this model, and then again, we can see that for the detailed processing mode, it initially has way more polygons compared to the area rendering mode or processing mode. However, we also to optimize this detailed processing mode way more. So we end up with a lower polygon count for the detailed processing mode compared to the area mode. How did that happen? Well, then we look at the UV map back again. So here the UV map for the detailed processing mode is way less fractured compared to the area processing mode, which then results in fewer texture artifacts, as you can see here. So this again shows the original and two optimized models, and if you follow this crack, you can see that for the detailed processing mode, the crack looks mostly the same. There are some slight changes here and there. But if you look at the area mode, well, yeah, it speaks for itself. The crack is barely visible here and it looks all warped. So from this, you can already say we're not going to use the area processing mode. But what's funny about these two models is that the detailed processing mode is optimized 3 times as much compared to the area processing mode. So from this, we can say that the detailed processing mode is way more suitable for virtual reality. And now that we have our final 3D models, we can implement them in virtual reality. So how do I do that? Well, for that, I use something called Unreal Engine 5.3. It's just a widely used gaming engine used by many, many different people. And it allows us to easily create virtual reality applications. But in Unreal Engine, you can optimize your game even further to improve performance even more. So I did that. There are 3 ways I did that, although I'm not going into depth in the models. There's some, I'll talk about them later. Don't know who they are. So the first one, LOD, level of detail, is just a way to reduce the amount of polygons rendered by a player. And the second one, lighting, is just a way to reduce the impact on performance, because lighting in 3D games can be very, it has a high performance on impact. And then the third one is called level system. So instead of having one large level where the player walks through, you can have smaller levels where each level has their own certain objective. So to see if that actually works and if it's more intuitive, I took a survey, as you can see here. So here are just a bunch of people. I did a survey on many more people. And from the survey, I found out that having 3 levels is not only more intuitive, it also, well, it gives the player a sense of accomplishment when he does like a certain objective in the level, as well as an improved navigation, because the mines are very, very big. And even when we were in the Valkenburg mines, if we didn't have a guide, we would have been lost very easily. So this way you can, improve navigation within the mine. And then what we end up with is something like this. So these are just a bunch of screenshots from my demo. And you can see that it looks pretty good. It looks like you're actually in the mine. That's not just me saying, that's also people from the survey, but if I trust them. And yeah, this is also how I remembered being in the mines. And this basically brings us back to my research question. So how can LiDAR data and measures from the Valkenburg mines be obtained, optimized, and processed for virtual reality while preserving structural and visual fidelity for VROC? Well, what we saw today is that first we use iPhones to scan, using the long-range scan. And then in Scanniverse, we use the detailed rendering mode to get the best and highest quality 3D models. Then we use quadratic error metrics with edge contraction to basically simplify our 3D models such that they are light enough to be able to work on virtual reality. And afterwards, we just implement them in Unreal Engine 5.3 or any newer version, for that matter, just to create our virtual reality game and be able to just make an interactive experience. And with that, I want to thank you all for your attention. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them.
Thank you very much. You have a big audience, so I guess there will be a lot of questions. So who would like to kick off? Yeah.
How much of the mine did you actually implement into?
So the Valkenburg mines are very, very big. So we only scanned like a very small portion of it. I would say maybe only 1%, because it stretches like below the entirety of Valkenburg, basically. So it already took us 10 minutes to walk to our points of interest. So yeah, it's like a representative part.
Do you think the project would now be finished and would actually work for example, first year and second year students already, or should it be improved on?
There are definitely ways to improve the models more, but because for VBlock you also need to have a coherent world where every exercise is defined clearly in the world itself as well. So what I only did is just create a small demo where you can walk around it, but there's nothing to do there. And if you start implementing certain objectives, you also need to change that world around those objectives. Although I do think the models are basically final, the world itself isn't. Did it answer your question?
Yeah. More questions? Yeah, David?
Yeah, thanks for the work. Thanks for the presentation. Super nice to see all this. Being part of your work, it is indeed nice to see that you've done all that. I've been using my iPhone in scanning spots, and what you said definitely triggered me to a glasses question. The range for the LiDAR.
Yeah.
The long range is useful to port it into a VR setting, but if you want to do research or if you want the highest quality, would you then increase the range to 2.5 or something that's smaller, or do you stick with 5?
No, I would stick with 5 meter range, because if you do a lower range, you also have to stay closer to the pillar or whatever you're scanning, which in theory is good because that means you get a higher resolution texture basically, and maybe also a better structure. However, because then your UV map gets more fractured, you get more. Not only do you get more texture artifacts earlier, but you also get a higher polygon count. And because that's a high polygon count, you can't, at the end, you can't implement it in virtual reality, because there's a certain limit of polygons you can render at a time. And right now, I'm well below that limit. But if
Let me
you
know when
use
this
the
looks
medium
like
range
it should,
scan, then you're probably
I'll,
going to be above
do my
the
magic.
maximum polygon count.
And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
say the
Nice.
technology improved to the point that we can put any number of polygon counts on the VR. Then
Then you can use it. Yeah, you can't simplify it as much, but you can still use it if it's good enough.
thanks.
Mark?
Yeah.
Sure, Mark, go.
Sure. Thank you, Max. I have no idea how to build a computer game, but how difficult would it be from what you have now? You can now observe what you scanned, to implement things such as taking measurements with, for example, a tape measure. Would that be, because it would maybe be useful, would that be a very difficult thing to implement, or is it already there?
Well, it depends on who you ask, because for some people it's going to take a long time. If you look at tape measurements and everything like that, there's like the dedicated team that makes the VROC project. They have also studied game design and everything. For me, I probably can't do that, but I did implement some other features. Like there's I can show it actually. Ooh, scary formulas. So I did implement like a whole map system where you can also navigate between levels. But there's also an interactive object you can pick up somewhere. It is a gun. And there's also the ability for a second player to play the game, where they play as a spectator on the laptop. But for me to implement like the measuring tool and all the other things around it, that's not possible for me.
So it's not that the LiDAR data already contains the distance measurements.
Well, it is one-to-one scale, but no.
Yeah, Ramon, and then no, you are first. Yeah.
Would you say that, following up on David's question, would you say that it is an issue with the distance you use based on the size of the object that you're scanning? So for instance, if you were scanning a smaller dynamic object, or not necessarily.
Half full close up and
a
motion.
small
Sure.
object, would it then be easier to, or would it then be better to use a smaller, closer range scanning?
In theory, yes, because if your object is smaller, then the amount of polygons within it will also be smaller. So then you will be able to have a low enough polygon count to make it run properly on virtual reality.
Yeah.
So let's say you have like a small dog, for instance, or even better, I also have someone scans a certain body. You can use different scan range for this. You don't have to use the long range scan. Did that answer your question?
Put it anywhere where it makes sense.
Yes, thank you for your presentation.
One more?
Very nice. This is a bachelor thesis project, right? So
Yeah.
your final product is actually a PDF or a printed version of ink on paper. But what you made, your final product, is actually this 3D virtual reality environment.
Yeah.
And listening to your story and looking at the screenshots, I think none of us really got the impression of what you would see if you would have that instrument on. So what could you advise us as a university if we're going into this world and we have more of these kind of 3D products? How should we go about? Should we abandon a thesis and then just everybody gets the goggles and experiences it yourself? Or what would you advise us to do?
Initially for this presentation, I was planning to do like a little demo, like they do on some keynotes where they walk up to a table and they put on the headset. However, that's not possible for this thesis. However, I also did make a video where I just walk around the game. But yeah, I do think keeping a thesis would be like the whole report part would be still important, because I talk a lot of in-depth things about optimization and other things. But I think a good way, it's just best if you experience it yourself.
Right. Because your objective is that students are going to use it in the end, right? So we are all students sitting here listening to the teacher. So if this is a problem, then I guess there's something we need to solve first.
Yeah, well, it will be best if like everyone gets a VR headset, of course. But I think it will also be sufficient enough if only one person is studying something with VR.
Anything on there?
Then we can all see what he's doing basically. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, but I think we still need to do something.
Yeah, that's
So ideally, I could imagine, and maybe it's not too far in the future, that we would all have such headsets.
Yeah.
Like we have the phone in our pockets, but so, and you could give your presentation, we could look at it in 3D, right? And
I was also planning to add like a little video playing now, but then I realized that video was 3 gigabytes, so then I gave up on the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, so very good presentation, very good work. I may have missed it, but how is working the decimation tool? Is it a Python routine, or is it how can I do it on the model of the views or part of the viewer?
So you're asking basically how does the tool work for optimizing 3D model? Well, let's go back to the original figure. There we go. What I did it in Blender. So I use the decimation tool, as you said. Well, since Blender is open source, of course, I can look at how it works. And then I did find out that it uses QEM with edge contraction. It just basically beforehand it calculates all the cost of every edge. And then when you start optimizing, let's say you want to 50% of the initial polygon count. Then it basically just ranks all the edges based on the cost. And then it only will decimate collapses the highest 50% of the edges. And I think you can do it with very large models, like from, I think yours models has like 80 million polygons.
So it got some higher as well.
Okay, yeah. I haven't tested it, but in theory it should work, at least if your computer is powerful enough. Did that answer your question? Yep.
So I forgot what the final mode you used to create the meshes was. However, that one had a lot of polygons, if I remember correctly.
The detail processing mode.
Yes, detail processing mode. And you were able to optimize it more efficiently.
Yeah.
Would it also scale to just getting the raw data and making that mesh?
We could do that, but the thing is, I also looked into that, and that will be like a whole thesis on itself, because you also have to take into account the UV map, and that also changes when you start optimizing it. So that would have been very difficult for me, at least. But yeah, potentially that's also one of the recommendations in the thesis, where we just, instead of let Scanniverse do all the processing, we'll use another GitHub app, which was a bit experimental, but that gives the raw point cloud data. And then we just mesh it ourselves and then optimize it ourselves within Python, let's say, instead of using like the other software like Scanniverse and Blender. Does that answer your question? Yes.
I also have a question myself. So in your presentation, you show that there are in a way two ways to optimize the model. One is based on the polygons, and the other way is the texture.
Yeah.
And to me, it looks a little bit like the texture distortion is at the moment a bigger problem than the polygons.
Yeah.
So how can you give more value to the texture in the optimization?
Yeah. So yeah, the biggest problem with optimizing is of course the texture, because you get these weird artifacts. There are methods that take this into account when you start optimizing it. However, these methods are not open source, and then I also have to create like a whole program myself, which is going to take also another thesis probably. But also what I wanted to do initially is, because now how I assess these.
So from this side with your left
the
hand.
structure I can assess numerically. I just have like the model I showed earlier with the difference. Wrong slide. But if the texture I have to assess visually, because there's no way to visually assess the texture.
You can do another scoop.
So that's also one of the recommendations where we just make like a numerical analysis basically of the textures.
Maybe you have to ask the geologist.
I think it's good. Let me quickly
how
check.
to detect faults in models, and then use that to get the punishment term.
But potentially, because yeah, if you have like let's say
That's what you
that
had in
one
mind.
crack which I showed earlier, this one. If you can make like a model say, if you identify this crack somehow in a model,
There
and
is no
then
flower
the model says, "Oh, I
there.
can't see the crack anymore now." Then you say, "Please stop," or just
In there,
increase the polygons.
not visible. Well, like very little, almost nothing. There, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't highlighted, so okay, I'll tell them.
But then maybe the algorithm is better to adjust also the textures. Instead of taking one step, take 10 steps.
Well, it doesn't really matter if you do it in smaller steps, because the cost base for every edge basically doesn't change if you take one big step or smaller steps. So it would
for the polygon, probably won't change, but for the textures changes.
Yeah, but that's still because it uses the same algorithm then basically to optimize the edge, or to construct the edges basically. So it's still going to optimize the same way, and then there's still going to be the exact same texture artifacts which then appear.
Maybe a last question actually for Dominique, and that is, I have also a question for you, but I'll go first.
We implement the little exercise that we discussed, but then afterwards,
So
students understand better what is going on in this mind search collapsing.
So do you mean more like how can we improve the whole experience, or do you mean more what are the exercises? So what I would recommend is that when you look at basically the final models, you can't really see it here. It would of course be best if I was standing here with VR headset on, but that's not the case here. One of the problems with the 3D world basically is how the different 3D models connect to each other. So what we did in the mines was we scanned our pillars or our points of interest, and then at some point I also scanned like a representative part of the floor and the roof, and then I used that to connect basically all the pillars to each other. However, the problem with that is that it doesn't look nice near the edges. So here you can see like there's something wrong going on over there, as well as here, and as well as up there. So what I would recommend is that the XRZone team or whoever else does it improves the transition between every single model, such that it looks more realistic compared to just models clearly stitched to each other. Oh, something like that. Everything's possible, but well, something like that would take a long time, because all the 3D models here are also kind of hollow. So if you look behind them, well, then there's nothing. So then you really have to start modeling your pillars, which I'm sure the VR team can do that, the XR Zone team can do that, but that's going to take a long time. So it will be best if you have if all your models are just static, that they don't change. However, for the not dynamic objects, there's also a permanent install tool. I think it's the extensometer. That's something you can model because that's just a simple rectangular shape, which you can then open with a small little door. I don't think I have pictures from that, so people know what I'm talking about. No, there's no picture of that.
Anyway, thank you very much for moving.
Okay.
Yeah, my question for you, Dominique, is when can we actually play it?
You can play it right now. I have it with me.
No, but I mean also when will the students, when will it be in class? Or do you know the time schedule? Okay. That's fine.
No.
Okay, well then I think that's it for now. And I'm sure if you approach Maxx, he has the goggles and he can give you the real experience.
Yeah.
But yeah. So thank you again.
Yeah, no problem.